And I'll wish you a Boker Tov again, Tzom Kal, since today happens to be the 17th of Tammuz, one of the minor fast days. We'll kind of refer to that or relate to it a little bit. But I think I want to start and deal with a number of other topics today. Actually, I have a few different things that I want to try to do today, and it might seem somewhat unconnected, but hopefully by the end, you'll see some kind of connection between all the things. So the first thing I want to do, and again, it's very easy to go Trump bashing, and you know, and I'm trying not to say this in a humorous way, because I think there's more a concern of tragic things that are being said and done. And I want to focus on just a couple of comments because it ties in very much with some of the things we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. So I don't know how many of you, and I guess I'll apologize for those of you who really have no inclination to listen to this kind of thing, but as I said, I just want to latch on to a couple of things mentioned because they're very much in line with some of the issues we've been discussing. So I don't know how many of you listened to the speech given in Washington on July the 4th by the president, but one thing caught my attention again, in light of some of the things we've discussed. So I'm just going to read two very, very brief paragraphs. And this is not necessarily from the beginning or the end or whatever. One of the paragraphs said was this: "That is why we pay tribute to generations of American heroes whose names are etched on our monuments and memorials and in the pages of history and in the hearts of a very grateful people." So nothing wrong with that. Sounds very connected to the past, giving tribute to those whom we respect and would like to emulate, etc. But at the same time, the power of that, in light of what's been going on over the last few weeks, etched on our monuments and memorials. It sounds like there's some kind of hint at a sarcasm, cynicism, even criticism of those who may have a different opinion about the names of heroes whose names are etched on monuments and memorials. And of course, why leave anything to uncertainty? We will never, this is another quote, "We will never allow an angry mob to tear down our statues, erase our history, indoctrinate our children, or trample on our freedoms." And this is from the White House website, and of course in brackets after that it says applause. "We will safeguard our values, traditions, customs, and beliefs. We will teach our children to cherish and adore their country so that they can build its future. Together, we will fight for the American dream, and we will defend, protect, and preserve American way of life, which began in 1492 when Columbus discovered America." So when I heard that, I guess I don't hesitate to say I was somewhat appalled and not surprised, because we've been talking for the last couple of weeks about narrative and about how we remember, recall things, how we celebrate and commemorate different events in our understanding of history. And we tried to stress the importance of perhaps taking a broader view of narrative, and while wanting to maintain things we hold dear, being aware and acknowledging that there are other narratives. And especially after so many states, as I mentioned to you last week, had changed Columbus Day. They changed the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. When the president, or any leader, it doesn't make a difference, says that the American way of life began in 1492 with the discovery, when Columbus discovered America, it hit me so powerfully, because when we discussed discovery, we said discovery is a very ethno-national centric term. Discovery means that we found something that really didn't exist in any significant way before. We're the ones who discover it. It wasn't there. It wasn't of relevance before until we showed up on the shores of the Americas, say the white Europeans. America had no value to the world, no relevance, no significance. It's our presence there that built what is there. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But in light of the discussion of trying to show a greater sensitivity to other narratives, whether it be Black, Indigenous, female, whatever, I just found it very annoying, to say the least, to hear something like that on America's Day of Independence, meaning history in this part of the world did not exist before 1492. I am delighted, as we've, I think, learned in recent years and in our classes over the last few weeks, that Canada has certainly taken a different approach. No politician in their right mind in Canada would say anything like that, would not say that history began in Canada, in the northern part of North America, when Jacques Cartier landed wherever he did, when John Cabot, landed where he did. So that's not the beginning of history here. That's not the beginning of narrative. That's a certain interpretation of a European perspective, but nothing more than that. And I'm glad to say in Canada, even though there's a long way to go in recognizing, acknowledging, and remedying the trauma caused to Indigenous peoples here, we're a long way from this, and that's good to see. But then I thought, okay, so we learn about, we acknowledge, we allow our leaders, our politicians to do something, to try to do something about reconciliation and other means of trying to recognize and help those people whom we've harmed so much over the centuries. But what do we do about it? What do we really do to be aware and acknowledge other narratives? So we're talking about the Indigenous narrative. As Jews, and Canadian Jews at that, we certainly have to continue to learn, as we have been, about the Indigenous narrative. But there are others that are perhaps a little more challenging, and I would say even awkward and perhaps painful to deal with. So when we talk about Israel, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but when we talk about Israel, in Israel, there are also different narratives about what has happened there, certainly in the last 100 years. And I would say that if we are aware of the fact that, to go back to Indigenous issues, today happens to be Nunavut Day in Canada. So rather than talk about Discovery Day or Columbus Day or landing at Quebec Day, we talk about the fact that there is a people, a culture in the North that have a day to celebrate, not just for them to celebrate, for Canadians to spend time in learning. Oh, it's Nunavut Day? What's Nunavut? Where is that in Canada? As I'm sure many Canadians would be asking if I were to share that information with them. So if we use our curiosity, we should go and explore that. But getting back to the challenging competing narratives with regards to Israel, and certainly its founding 72 years ago, are we willing to explore the narratives, the Palestinian narrative? And how do we explore a narrative that is so different and often opposed and antithetical to ours? So part of that, and we'll get to this a little bit later in a more local context, part of that is familiarizing ourselves with both individuals, from whom we often see as opponents or foes, and familiarizing ourselves with culture, history, and narrative of that people. And so I'm putting a challenge to you this morning that in light of the use of the word Discovery Day, I want this class to be a discovery day for you. And your assignment in the coming weeks is going to be to discover, and we'll pick something that's fairly easy, to discover something about music in other cultures that you're not familiar with. So I'm going to start today with familiarizing you or allowing you to discover, although it may not be new to many of you, music from Arab culture. Now, many of you have perhaps some kind of view, understanding, familiarity, distaste, disgust for Arabic music, whether it's because of the language, whether it's because of its association with people we've often seen as our enemies, and perhaps rightly so for many decades. But part of understanding another culture, part of being willing to acknowledge at least a step in that process, the narrative of others, is to learn something about their culture and get familiar or at least somewhat less uncomfortable with it. So I'm going to play a song for you. I'm just going to share my screen with you for a moment. Let's make sure I got the right thing here. Let me just make sure you're going to be able to hear it. 1 second. Okay, so I decided several months ago, every week or few weeks to try to explore music from different cultures. And when I started, interesting, with Arabic music. So I found this singer, Zayn al-Jundi, a woman initially from Syria. You see a little, if you watch my cursor, you see in the bottom corner here, traditional songs from Syria. Now, automatically, and I chose Syria because Syria's been in the news so much lately. We have all sorts of associations with Syria, with the leadership there, with the revolt going on, somewhat dismantled in recent months, but a very troubling situation there for the millions of people who live there, for the millions who are in a Syrian diaspora living in other countries, including Canada. One of the families, which we happen to partially adopt and sponsor here from the synagogue, by the way. So I chose Syria, and I chose this singer, and I'm not going to give you more information about her. I'm going to count on your curiosity to explore who Zayn al-Jundi is, what's her background, where is she, where does she live today, what's she doing. But I want you to hear a very traditional song sung by her. I'm not sure exactly what year it's from. It's called Ya Ta'ira Tiri, Fly, O Bird. All right, so I'm going to play that for you now. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. I'm hoping that it'll be loud enough and heard. Hopefully I've put the settings in the right place.
على دين العشق حرام والله نزلت دموعي على خدي من يوم فراقك يا وعدي شرف حبيبي لا عندي بعدوك واني بنار يكفى عذاب حرام والله أنا على ديني جننتيني أنا على ديني جننتيني على دين العيش حرام والله يا طيري يا حمامة وانتيلي الدمر والهام هاتيلي من حبي علامة ساعة وخاتم المال يكفى عذاب حرام والله أنا على ديني جننتيني أنا على ديني جننتيني على دين العيش حرام والله يا طيرة طيري يا حمامة وانزلي الدمر والهامة هاتيلي من حبي علامة ساعة وخاتم المال يكفى عذاب حرام والله أنا على ديني جننتيني أنا على ديني جننتيني على دين العيش حرام والله
Okay. I want to ask, you're all off mute now, so we have to do this appropriately. So I have a couple of comments I want to make, but I wanted to ask, what does music do to any of you? So just raise your hand so I can see. So
I
not
have a
everybody.
question, Michael.
Okay, Brenda, you go ahead then.
I didn't hear your first question. What was your question before that?
So my question is, what is your response to that music?
I think it's beautiful, and I sent you a comment. Are you familiar with Aaron Lightstone's group Jaffa Road?
Yes.
Okay, and if you listen to their music, it incorporates a lot of a beautiful, beautiful combination of Israeli and traditional Arab music, and they are amazing, and they've done an outstanding job.
That's okay. That's true, Brenda, but I don't want you to compare it to anything. I want you to tell me.
I'm not comparing, I'm just commenting.
Okay.
But I enjoyed it. I thought it was beautiful.
Okay. Anyone else? What did the music do to you? Barb, go ahead.
It makes you want to move. You don't just sit there, but there's a rhythm. You're tapping your fingers all of a sudden. The toes are tapping. The drumming is very characteristic, and there's a real rhythmic sound to it.
Okay. Anyone else?
Very, very Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you this, because sometimes when we're doing talks on various subjects and we bring in some music, we often take a piece of that music. How many of you, I'm just going to mute everybody, I hear a lot of noise in the background of somebody. How many of you, and just by a show of hands if you want, how many of you thought, the piece was 5.5 minutes long, how many of you thought at some point, all right, I got the idea after a minute or 2 minutes, I don't need to hear the rest of it. Just put up your hand if any of you felt that way. Okay, and that's honest, and that's it's not a criticism of anybody. Sometimes when we're listening to something different, we just want to have a taste of it, at least in our minds. But if you think about it, it's not fair that there's a song recorded. If you were to listen to your favorite song, you would not stop it. Okay, you know, I got the taste of that. That's great. I got the 2 minutes. I don't need the last 2.5 minutes for that. You know, whether it's a Beatles song, Frank Sinatra, Lady Gaga, whatever it is, you're probably going to listen to the whole song. So out of deference and respect for the people who composed, recorded, and sang the song, it makes sense to listen to the end of it, as painful, awkward, unnecessary you might deem that to be. And I think it's very important as well. It would have been easy for me to give you a translation of the song, but I didn't want to do that, because part of familiarizing yourself with another culture is not to try to put it in your terms, in your language. It's to listen to the rhythm, the sound of the music and the language without being familiar with it, without knowing what it means in your terms. Listen to it in the other culture's terms. Again, even if you don't understand a word, listen to the sound, the guttural sound of that Arabic. Just listen to the rhythm. Listen to the rhymes if you can detect those. That's part of familiarizing yourself with the culture. Just like reading the Torah in English or Greek or any other language is not the same as reading it in Hebrew. You have to, if you want to have some kind of genuine experience, you got to listen to it in the original language without trying to translate it in whatever way we take that word translation meaning, whether linguistically or otherwise, into something that's familiar and comfortable for you. That is what discovery is about. That's what it means to acknowledge and try to familiarize yourself with the culture of another's culture, whether it be music, whether it be words, whatever. And so my challenge to you, after having listened to that piece, is every week, pick whatever culture with which you may have very little familiarity whatsoever, and try to listen to a piece of music, a genuine piece of music from that culture. And I'm not saying those who play music from a different culture are in any way insincere or not representative of that music, but always better, at least initially, to get as original an experience of another culture's music. So my challenge to you is next week, pick up something from any culture you want, wherever it may be, whatever part of the world, listen to a piece of music, and maybe share that with the rest, maybe just some impression about it next week. We won't have a chance to listen to all those pieces, although we may pick some time later on during the summer where we dedicate class just to hearing pieces of different music that you may have listened to. So that is my response to this idea of Discovery Day, of Columbus discovering America and creating the beginnings of American culture through that discovery. We need to make sure that we're open enough to acknowledge the existence of other cultures, other narratives, and start to learn about it before we make any type of judgment or evaluation. And I've always felt that music is a wonderful entry into another culture. It's perhaps, if somewhat awkward and initially unpleasant, it's probably the safest media in which to explore another culture. Anyway, that's my opinion of that. Now, getting back to what I started with, but very much in connection with this opening, is when we look at this week's Parsha Pinchas, as well as last week's Parsha and other Parshiot, we find many individuals, deities, acting in what you might call a rather rash manner, responding to events in a way that doesn't necessarily seem to be using one's rational abilities, from their gut, intuitively, and often driven by emotion rather than any kind of rational consideration. Even if we look at the verbs used in various descriptions of this week's event, when we look at Parshat Pinchas, we find one word used 3 times in the same sentence, kano. And I'll come back, kuf nun aleph. I'll come back to that in a minute. But when we consider all the other narratives in the Torah, at least many of them, we find that the characters that we regard often fairly highly are those who react and respond to their circumstances in an emotional way, often out of fear. For example, the fear of being unable to bring children into the world, the fear of more powerful neighbors. They may respond out of jealousy for a concubine, another wife, a favored sibling, other gods. They may respond out of anger, rebelliousness of individuals or the people as a whole. And there are many other examples, of course, but coming back to this week's Parshat Pinchas, even though the event took place at the end of last week's Parsha, we come across this word kano, which is translated in different ways, and it's used 3 times in the same verse. Let me just read the verse for you so you get the sound of it, even if you're not familiar with the Hebrew. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen Heshiv et chamati me'al b'nei Israel, bekan'o et kinati betocham, velo chiliti et b'nei Israel bekinati. So what does that word kano, kaniti, kinati, what does that word mean? As I said, in the JPS, it's translated as passion. Sometimes it's translated as jealousy, sometimes as zealousness. And the zealous perhaps is relevant because when we talk about a group during the Second Temple period, because we're remembering events leading up to the destruction of the temple, today, the 17th of Tammuz, that minor fast day that I mentioned at the beginning, we talk about a group known as the Kanaim, the zealots, often translated in English, people who responded to their circumstances in no question, a very rash, impassioned, zealous manner, leading to very perhaps catastrophic consequences, not only because of their action, but something that certainly precipitated what occurred later on. And so why am I spending so much time on this one word? Because I think passion, if often described or associated with a very powerful love or affinity for, you say, I have a passion for something. I have a passion for ballet. I have a passion for music. I have a passion for sports. Something, a very intense endearment of some kind of activity. I think it's a good word because often passion is kind of undefined. The one thing we can say about passion, it is something very powerful. It's something that perhaps many of us would love to experience, but passion can often come with violence. It can often come with all sorts of risks. And although I might say as exhilarating and thrilling an experience as living in passion may be, it's something that most of us probably would like to avoid on most occasions. It's something we'd rather leave in the mode of imagination, of thinking about what it might be like to be impassioned with something, whether it be love or anything else, but perhaps a bit afraid of the implications, about losing control. Passion is often about the loss of self-control in one way or another and acting rashly in whatever circumstances you may be. And so when we talk about Parshat Pinchas, we come across an individual who acted out of passion. Now, you may say, as many of the commentators do, that that passion was warranted. That passion was necessary. The circumstances demanded somebody to act in an immediate way that would resolve the issue of the Israelites, at least the Israelite men, whoring with the Moabite women, and particularly a couple who was doing something very indecent and inappropriate in the area of the Mishkan. So it had to be dealt with. Rather than have God strike them down, as God often does in the Tanakh, Pinchas acted in God's behalf, and therefore, interestingly, was granted all the privileges coming with being the Kohen Gadol, the high priest in the next generation. But there's a fascinating element here as well, because when it talks about that final verse of the first Aliyah, it says, Lachen emor, hineni noten lo et briti shalom. Because Pinchas, and I'll translate that first verse to you, Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath, chamati, again, God's wrath. He was able to avert the consequences of God, what God might do to the children of Israel by killing this couple from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me. So that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion, say therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. So his reward, Pinchas's reward, as we know later on, in addition to becoming the Kohen Gadol, he's given this idea of a pact of friendship with God. Who else has a pact of friendship with God in the Tanakh? Where else is that Brit Shalom with God? Listen, who else has that?
Moses.
No, doesn't say about a Brit Shalom with Moses. Avraham doesn't have a Brit Shalom. He has another type of covenant and contract with God, but not of peace, not in the same way. And Pinchas is unique in that, possibly because of the catastrophic events or the catastrophic implications, not just for that couple, but for Pinchas himself. When one acts rashly, as I mentioned before, we are often afraid of that impassioned action and mode because we're afraid of what we might do and not be aware of implications from our acts only to be experienced or suffered afterwards. We don't think about those things. We act without thought whatsoever of implications. We see a certain thing happening, we've got to respond to it. We don't consider everything that might happen as a result of that. Similarly, Pinchas acted in a rash manner, impassioned, zealous, wanting to defend God's good name and God's sanctuary. And that is justified. Is the action Pinchas took the only one that might have been taken? Is it the right one in the circumstances? Far be it from me or others, although many commentators have tried, to justify it in that way. What we can be certain of, based on the text, is that there are implications that Pinchas wasn't aware of initially and that he has to live with for the rest of his life. The vav in the word shalom, peace, here called friendship, is broken. It's the only letter in the entire Torah that is not whole, because when we come across a letter written by a scribe that is not complete, that makes the Torah unusable ritually. We can't read from that Torah. It doesn't mean we have to write the whole Torah again, but we have to fix that word. We have to fix that specific letter. In this case, that letter is purposely left broken, as Pinchas is as a result of his deeds. So what do we learn from that? And again, this is what some commentators say. Yes, that deed was necessary, but there are consequences. And sometimes we do things in an impassioned manner because we feel they need to be done, and maybe they need to be done. We need to strike out. We need to be perhaps violent, as according to our interpretation, against enemies of ours, perhaps, that only understand violence, in an interpretation and an expression often used with regards to that. But there are implications for that, for ourselves as much as for anyone else. And if we're not initially aware of that, we certainly become aware of that afterwards. I'll just give you a very brief example. You talk about soldiers, and in recent generations, those who fought not even the Second World War or Vietnam, but in Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder. That is what Pinchas probably at least initially experienced. The idea of killing someone or a couple so violently by sticking a spear through the guts of both of them, that has to have some effect on somebody. I don't think anyone is immune from the implications of killing two people in that manner. You may say there are natural born killers who are immune to those types of emotions. I'm not convinced that that's the case, although sometimes it seems that way, and I'm not a psychologist, so don't hold me to that. But there are implications for any type of deed done, and I think the Torah is very wise in explaining that perhaps this was a deed that was necessary, but that person's going to suffer as a result, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's what needed to be done, and these are the implications for that individual. So when we talk about passion, of course, there's an incredible amount of passion going on right now. And I use that word specifically, passion, because it's a lot of unbridled emotion on both sides of the various social dynamics that we're watching in the States, in Canada, and around the world. And again, whether it's with Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or any of the issues that have arisen in recent weeks and months, there is an ample supply of unbridled passion with which people are responding. And is that the way to deal with hatred and fear and anger and zealousness that we find in the Torah and that we find in great quantities in our world today? So our understanding is often that how do you deal, and this is often what we talk about, and back to the Israeli-Palestinian narrative. We've tried talking with them, but they don't understand talk. They only understand power. They only understand violence. If they're going to respond with violence, that's the way we have to respond as well. That's the only language they understand. And that's only one narrative. There are many other narratives from different conflicts in the past and in the present that have that same understanding of how we should be responding. So I want to play for you a fascinating interview, a podcast. I'll let you know in advance, it's about 14 minutes. But as we did with Zain al-Jundi's song, I want you to listen to the whole thing, and then we'll have a couple of minutes to talk about your thoughts on that afterwards, because it provides us with a kind of insight of how we might respond to passion, how we might respond to the negative side of passion, unbridled passion with which people often act out of control, or sometimes and mostly out of control. Anyone ever hear of somebody, a musician by the name of Daryl Davis? Okay, so hopefully this works. 1 second. Okay, there isn't so much a video for this, it's an audio, but there's this picture of perhaps a costumed individual who might look somewhat familiar to you. So.
Daryl Davis is a musician. He's also an actor and author. That's him on the piano. The keyboard is on fire during his performances.
Sorry, I just want to make sure, can you hear what is being played? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, thanks.
I mean, there are actual flames shooting up over his hands. It's part of his act. It also gives you a sense of the kind of guy Daryl is. Bold. Daryl?
Yes.
You are a black man.
I am.
How on earth did you first start making friends with members of the KKK?
That came about because I had met this Klansman in a bar where I was performing, and he had come up to me and remarked that this was the first time he ever heard a black man play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis. And I tried to explain to him the origin, the black origin of Jerry Lee's style, you know, the boogie woogie and the blues, which, you know, translated into rock and roll and rockabilly. And he did not believe me, and I explained to him, you know, I know Jerry Lee Lewis personally, and he's told me himself where he learned how to play. Well, the guy was still incredulous that Jerry Lee had learned anything from black people. But he was fascinated with me and wanted me to sit down at his table and have a drink and talk to me. And so I joined him at his table, and he remarked then that this was the first time he'd ever had a drink with a black man. And now I'm trying to figure out, you know, what on earth is going on here? What's with this guy? And I asked him why, and I was asking him naively and innocently. I wasn't trying to be, you know, facetious. And eventually it came out, he said that he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Oof. And I did not believe him. I started laughing because I thought he was, you know, pulling my leg or something. And he produced his membership card and handed it to me. I
gotta say, I frequent some drinking establishments from time to time, and I've been known to sit at a bar, and if someone sat next to me, and I'm a woman of color, and pulled out their KKK membership, my reaction might be to get the hell out of there.
Well, see, that's what they bank on, because, you know, the biggest weapon known to man is the least expensive. It's not a grenade launcher or nuclear missile. It's fear. Fear. Fear is why the KKK is still here. People fear that robe and that hood when they see it. You know, you see somebody walking down the street coming towards you in a suit and tie or a Hawaiian shirt and Bermuda shorts, you know, you don't run the other way. But you see somebody coming towards you in a robe and hood, you cross the street or you back up or, you know, start running. But guess what? The guy in the Hawaiian shirt and the suit and tie might feel the exact same way as the guy in the robe and hood.
Okay, so, I mean, it sounds like the start of a terrible joke. Black guy sitting at a bar and KKK guy and sits up, you know, comes in, sits down next to him. What happens next?
Well, he gave me his phone number. And he wanted me to call him anytime I was to return to this bar with this band, because he wanted to bring his friends, meaning Klansmen and Klanswomen, to see this black guy play like Jerry Lee. And so I agreed to call him, and I would call him, every 6 weeks on a Wednesday or a Thursday and say, hey, man, we're going to be at the Silver Dollar this weekend. Come on out. He'd come out both nights, Friday and Saturday. He'd bring Klansmen and Klanswomen, and they would gather around the bandstand and watch me play the piano with the band. And then on the break, usually I would head over to his table. Some of the Klan members would stick around. They wanted to meet me and talk to me. Others, when they saw me coming, they'd get up from their chair and, scurry away towards the back of the room or something.
So that first encounter in a bar happened decades ago. It
Yes.
kind of got you hooked. Since then, as you say, you've made it your personal project to befriend members of the Ku Klux Klan, to sit with them, to talk with them. Help me out. I mean, how the heck does a conversation like that go? What is your opening line?
Well, it could be anything depending upon the person. So, why are you in the Klan? What do you hope to accomplish? What kind of music do you like?
Really?
And,
what kind of music do you like?
Yeah. And some of them like rock and roll, some of them like blues, some of them like country, but what's funny is the majority of music that they like was actually created or influenced by black people.
So you find that common ground. And as you say, sometimes it's one of the natural ones is music. How does that then turn into a deeper conversation about racism and hatred of you?
Yes. Well, I find out, what is the problem? Why do you feel that I don't have a place here in this country?
And what do people say? I know you get a lot of responses.
Yeah, they have different responses. Well, this is a white man's land. White men discovered America. White men built America. This is our homeland, and you all need to go back to where you came from. And I remind them, look here, you all brought me here. You all brought me here, and no, you did not build this country. It was built on the backs of my ancestors.
You ever hear you're naturally violent because who you are?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. I can tell you.
Black people are violent?
Yes.
Common thing that you hear from white supremacists?
Yes, and I can tell you a story about this guy. His rank was Exalted Cyclops, and he was riding around in my car with me. And he said, they say that all black people have a gene within them that makes them violent. And I said, look here, man. I said, I'm as black as anybody you've ever seen. I have never done a carjacking. I have never done a drive-by. How do you explain that? He didn't even think about it for 1 second. He didn't even pause. He answered me, boom, like that. He said, your gene is latent. It hasn't come out yet. So I didn't even know how to even bite into that and dissect it because it was so far out in left field. I said, well, they say all white people have within them a gene that makes them a serial killer. And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, well, name me 3 black serial killers. He couldn't name me any. I named one for him. I said, here, I'm going to give you one. Just name me 2. He couldn't do it. I rattled off Charles Manson, Jeffrey Dahmer, Henry Lee Lucas, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. I said, they're all white. I said, son, you are a serial killer. He said, Daryl, I've never killed anybody. I said, well, your gene is latent, hasn't come out yet. And he says, well, that's stupid. And I said, well, duh. And I said, but yes, it is stupid. But I said, it's no more stupid for me to say that about you than what you said about me. And he got very, very quiet. But I could tell that his wheels in his head were spinning, out of control. And within 5 months, this man had left the Klan.
Wow. Daryl Davis has had hundreds of conversations like that with Klan members, and he guesses about 200 people have ended up leaving the KKK as a result. People like this guy.
Well, I'm Scott Shepard, born and raised in Indianola, Mississippi, the home of B.B. King, and unfortunately the home of the White Citizens Council, too, which was a white supremacist organization. I officially joined about 16 years old and became Grand Dragon of the state of Tennessee, which is on the level of governor if you look at it in terms of politics. Beliefs were strictly, the white race was the most supreme race on earth, and the Ku Klux Klan, vowed to defend that and the white race at any means necessary, including violence.
So Scott was deeply embedded in the Klan. He focused on recruitment by targeting kids from troubled homes. He was buddies with David Duke, the Klan leader at the time, officially known as Grand Wizard. And it was around then, sometime in the 1980s, when Scott first saw Daryl on TV.
I listened to a little bit of what it was, and I'll be honest with you, and I've told him, I thought he was a nutcase. And I felt that way for a long time. And then finally, I guess I saw him on the Discovery Channel. That time, I listened to what he had to say and watched the entire show. And I just said, I need to talk to this guy because what he's saying sound is right. It made sense to me.
After that second time Scott saw Daryl on TV just under a decade ago, Scott decided to reach out to him. They ended up talking on the phone, just chatting about, well, at first, music, and then the KKK.
I was also kind of in the process of, withdrawing from the white supremacist movement at that time. And I had nowhere to turn, didn't have any guidance or anything, and I needed someone to guide me. And I was stuck in between, I had friends that didn't like me because I had joined the white supremacist movement. And then I had the white supremacists that didn't like me, some of them because they knew I was trying to get out. And that, is very, very touchy subject because, sometimes you don't get out, you either, get killed or end up in prison.
What was it for you, Scott, that actually cut through the hate for you? Was there one moment or something that Daryl said where it clicked?
Well, just the idea or the action of Daryl talking to me was one thing, because I really didn't expect him to talk to me. He didn't know me, but just Daryl showing me his interest and caring was the biggest thing. From that point on, there was trust that I had gained for Daryl, and it was just an amazing thing, to feel, because here he is, Daryl is black, showing me love and respect, and he's one of the races that I really condemned or really hated.
Daryl, tell me this. What has all of these conversations taught you about hate?
That you cannot hate the hate out of a person. You cannot beat the hate out of a person, but you can love it out of a person.
What do you mean?
It's like darkness, as someone said, only light can drive out the dark. You don't combat hate with hate. Okay, so Scott hated me, so I'm going to hate him back even more. Or Scott, hates me so much, I'm going to beat the hate out of him. That does nothing. Like we saw August 12th, to be precise. And
you're talking about Charlottesville.
I'm talking about Charlottesville, okay? What happened? This group of non-racists came down there to beat the hate out of the hateful racists, and it didn't work. And somebody ended up getting killed, murdered, I will say. You're not going to beat the meanness out of a mean dog. You start beating a mean dog, it's going to become more mean. You start beating racists, they're going to become more racist.
Daryl, the kind of hate you're talking about, it goes so deep. It's intergenerational, it's within families, it's organized. This isn't just a set of mistaken beliefs that can be corrected. It is a worldview. So how do you cut through hate that's so ingrained like that?
Yes, it is ingrained. However, it is learned behavior, and it is learned through dialogue. Nobody is, you use the term intergenerational. However, it is not something that is hereditary. You learn it from your parents, you learn it from your environment, your friends, your workplace, or whoever you associate with that has that mindset. And, they talk to you. You learn it through dialogue. So if you can learn hate and racism through dialogue, you can also unlearn it through dialogue. And I have proven that. Scott has proven that. okay, by sitting down and listening to somebody of another opinion, spending my time talking to people who may not necessarily have the same attitude that I do, and then they adopt it. So they are unlearning their hate through dialogue, and that's what's very important. This country has made a huge mistake by putting a taboo on the dialogue of talking about race. This is why it's very important now. You see all these women here in my country coming forward and talking about, you know, the abuse they've suffered at the hands of men, sexual abuse and all that kind of stuff. And now men are beginning to listen. It's that dialogue that is changing the culture. It's going to change the culture for women. It's going to change the culture for race. And we need more of that dialogue.
Scott, after you met Daryl, what'd you do with your KKK robe?
Daryl has it.
Daryl has it.
That's right.
Really?
Daryl has it. Yes, ma'am.
It's hanging at my house.
I don't think it fits him, but he's got it. Love you, man.
Love you too.
What did you think of that interview? So let me just add a couple of comments before anybody responds. First of all, this was recorded in October of 2018, and they're referring, of course, to that Charlottesville incident with the white supremacist group, where a white woman who was part of the demonstration was actually killed, run over by somebody who ran into the crowd there. That took place almost 2 years ago. And I found it fascinating as well that where does Scott, this Ku Klux Klan leader, find Daryl and have some kind of moment? On the Discovery Channel. Watches him on the Discovery Channel. Anyway, if anyone wants to share some comments before we sum up, please feel free to do so. Anyone want to have anything to say? I'll take you off mute, just raise your hand. Go ahead, Marla. Marla, I can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. So I'll go to somebody else, see if you can fix the microphone issue. Anyone else want to share some comment? John, go ahead.
Yes, it looks like a good study of causeless hatreds where the two examples of what the stereotype fear of black you have associated with black people, and you have the black person talking about associated fear of white people with serial killer versus drive-by shooters. Both of them are stereotypes. Both of them are extremely rare, yet people have this conception that that's what these people are like. There's no logic to it, no reason. Okay, thanks, John. Lorraine, you had a comment as well?
Yeah, I saw that on the Discovery last week. What fascinated me was the number of whites that were serial killers.
Yeah, let's just be careful we don't make too many generalizations about that either, as tempting as it might be. Marian, you had a comment.
I think that what it's proving is that dialogue helps. The fact that people talking things out rather than talking about hatred, but just talking as one person to another, no race involved, is what probably helped these two people. They didn't say, I'm white and you're black. They just talked as two people. Dialogue, I think, does help without violence.
Okay. Marla had wanted to share, if she wasn't able to do it vocally. I like that only light can help with dark. Thank you, Marla.
Michael?
Melanie, go ahead.
I'm wondering, is there a link to that clip that you can share with us?
Absolutely. I'll try to get it there before the end of the session. And if not, I'll just email me and I'll get it to you. But hopefully I'll get it up there while we're talking.
Okay,
I
appreciate
like to
it.
consider myself a multitasker. Sometimes I'm not as good at it as I'd like to believe.
Don't sell yourself short.
Brenda, you have a comment.
Yeah, to go back to this week's parashah, Pinchas, although he acted out of passion, and I think he acted out of passion, was fear of the Midianites, of the Midianites, and of course fear of the Israelite who was with the Midianite woman Cosby. Do you think that if he had talked to them first, it would have made a difference? I don't think in this case talk would have made any difference. I think Pinchas, although was passionate and violent, was justified. So in that instance, dialogue I don't think would have made any difference.
Okay, so if we were to ask Daryl, how many conversations, they mentioned that they feel that probably about 200 people have left the clan because of their interaction with Daryl. If you were to ask him, with how many people have you interacted, I imagine it's several hundred, and the majority of those have not left the clan. They have not been convinced. There are people out there with whom dialogue is not going to be effective, but I think the message here, the alternative, is not very good. There's probably nothing lost in trying if done in a safe way. I mean, I don't know if as a black person or as a Jewish person, I would arrange to meet in some dark alley for the first time with a class person. But there are ways of doing it, and Daryl has certainly found an effective one to engage people by finding common ground. I began at the beginning with Arabic music because of this interview. Daryl found one of the ways, and if not the only way, one of the ways of engaging people is finding something that they can identify with, even if they're misunderstanding about the origins of that music, or they may have misunderstandings. You need to find an entrance to engaging with people, and perhaps discussion with others as part of our experience might be best done with some kind of engagement through music, ours and theirs. So that's one lesson certainly to be taken from this. And I just want to share very briefly in summary.
Could I just ask a question?
Other than what, Avi, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. We see that there's a lot of violence here today, even in Toronto, even in the United States. And when you were referring to Daryl and his KKK group, that shows us that there's always leads to improvement and always interact with each other through some kind of aspect of the music, for example, storytelling or some kind of thing to get us to talk about this more.
That's right. I wouldn't say, I'd be careful about saying whether it can always help, but it certainly probably can't hurt. And there are always other paths to try before the one that we often see not so much as last resort, but often as first resort. And I think we need to take that seriously. I just want to finish with one consideration of our tradition. What does our tradition say about impassioned response? What does it say about letting the emotions rule us as opposed to trying to adopt a more rational and considered approach? So in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, in chapter 4, it starts out, you're probably all familiar with, Ezehu chacham halomed mikol adam, who is wise, he who learns from every person. And then, Ezehu gibor, hakovesh et yitzro, shene'emar, tov erech apayim migibor, umoshel berucho miloched ir. Who is strong? He who subdues his personal inclination. Again, perhaps better translated as his passions. He who is slow to anger is better than the strong man, and a master of his passions is better than a conqueror of a city. That's from Mishle, from Proverbs 16, chapter 16, verse 32. And so my challenge to you is that we look for alternatives to perhaps the most common ways of dealing with our passions. Yes, we want to control our passions. We don't want to eliminate our passions, God forbid. That's certainly not something we want to do, but we need to find a way to use them in an effective manner. And part of that is trying to step aside occasionally from challenging and emotionally laden circumstances and find a way, other than responding rashly, find a way of engaging in some kind of dialogue, interaction, a positive, effective dynamic with the other, with a perceived foe or enemy, and at least try that. As Daryl has shown us, there's certainly a way to go about doing that, if not completely and always effective. And I'll just finish with a line from the end of the Amidah. And for this reason, I like the Sim Shalom Sidur, because it offers an alternative to that final meditation at the end of the Amidah. Usually, Elohai Netzor L'Shoni Rema, keep my tongue from evil. There's another one that says, may it be your will, Adonai my God and God of my ancestors, that your compassion prevail over your wrath, and that you turn to us with love. And as I always suggest with Birchot HaShachar, when we talk about praising God for doing certain things, that is, we're supposed to be instructing ourselves to do that. So while we ask God to control their wrath before acting out rashly, that's really what we're saying to ourselves. Next time, before we act in a way that we're probably or possibly going to regret and have remorse for later on, let's take a moment, step aside, look at a way for engaging in dialogue in that situation if possible, and perhaps mitigate, if not eliminate, implications that we have no desire to experience later on. So I thank you all for joining me today, and we look forward to continuing the study. Don't forget your assignment. You don't have to share it necessarily next week, but I look forward to hearing which culture you have dared and been courageous enough to venture into through music. We'll start with music. There are many other ways, as Abby suggested, storytelling as well. Let's try for music. Daryl seems to have found that as an effective means for initial engagement. So have a wonderful day, everybody, and a great week.
Thank you, Michael. Beautifully done.
Thank you, Michael. Be well.
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
no problem, Michael.
Thank
was
you.
excellent.
Yes,
Everybody stay healthy. Shabbat shalom.
Yes. Yes, everybody stay well.
Shabbat
Take care.
shalom.
Have a great
Thanks,
day.
everybody.